the end of August in 1914, German and Russian forces would meet at the battle known as Tannenberg. Now, before we can discuss the Battle of Tannenberg itself, first we must go over the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was designed for German forces to march through neutral Belgium and capture France by taking Paris. Paris would force the French into a surrender, thus not having the Germans fighting on two fronts. So, with German intent being to march through France in about 45 days, taking all of their objectives and defeating the French, they would then march back to the Eastern Front, where they would engage in combat with the Russians. Now, while they were doing this, there would be defenses set up all alongside the Eastern Front, thus to counteract any Russian mobilization. However, it would be at one of these defensive fronts where the Battle of Tannenberg would take place. Now, getting to our German leadership. First, we have to look at General Maximilian Prittwitz. Prittwitz was a German commander at one of the outposts on the Eastern Front with the intent of stopping Russian movement. Now, his outpost had been hit multiple times by Russian forces in different waves, and after many long battles, Prittwitz wanted to surrender. German leadership, hearing this, decided that rather than take his opinion into matters, they would send him into retirement, replacing him with the retired Hindenburg, pulling him out of retirement and placing him on the front line to command troops once again. Assisting Hindenburg would be General Ludendorff. General Ludendorff, as well, a veteran. Now, Tannenberg as is already a historical battleground for the Germans and the Slavs, because back in 1410, the Teutonic Knights and the Slavs had battled it out there in a religious type war where many Germans and Slavs had lost their lives. Now, this is important to note because 500 years later, the Germans would come back to this battleground. Even though technically Tannenberg was many miles away of where the battle was actually fought in 1914, Hindenburg still decided that he wanted to commemorate his fallen ancestors and avenge their loss. Now, who came to Tannenberg with Hindenburg? Well, Hindenburg would be commanding the 8th German Army, consisting of roughly 150,000 German troops, with roughly 300 of their machine guns and about 700 pieces of artillery. Now, following this, the Germans would be outfitted with train supplies that would be able to keep up with the amount of disperse the Germans were placing towards the Russians. Now, to the battle itself. Technically, the battle did last about a week long, starting in August 23rd, lasting through the 30th. Now, to assist the Germans already, the Russians had been putting in a path of war throughout the towns on the eastern side of Germany and Russia. So a lot of German citizens were having to leave their destroyed homes and towns, which led to them supplying their army's forces with multiple intel reports on where the Russian forces were and what they were doing. Along with this, Russian radio signals were not the greatest and encrypted, and oftentimes the Russians didn't bother putting an encrypted code over their radio messages, so the Germans were able to see that, seize it, and then take that into their own account for their own intel. Along with this, in their findings, they found a German map, or a Russian map, that labeled where they were and what they were mobilizing. So ultimately, this all gave the Germans an edge in order to figure out where the Russians were, making their strategies much more effective and much more deadly to the Russians. Now, the real fighting starts on the 25th of August, with the 1st and 2nd German infantry divisions advancing on General Samsonov's forces. Samsonov's forces were moved ahead of Rennenkampf's forces because of disagreements between Samsonov and Rennenkampf led to Samsonov's men being pushed farther forward. Now, General Samsonov's men were quickly being destroyed as the 2nd Russian Infantry Division was not as well prepared or well trained as the German soldiers were. This led to quite some time in battle and ultimately led the Russians to being outnumbered and outmatched. Now, Samsonov did not initially see this because he was unaware of his flanks from where his position was in the battlefield. Thus, the Germans were able to maneuver around his forces, cutting off his flanks and encircling Samsonov's men. Now, once Samsonov was made aware of this, his men surrendered, and Samsonov himself marched out into the forest where he took his own life because he did not want to deal with the wrath of the Russian leadership, knowing that he had lost in war. Now, after Samsonov's defeat, the Germans were nipping at the heels of the Russians, to say the least, because this caused Rennenkampf to panic, and this pushed him into a retreat, with Hindenburg chasing his forces and ultimately ending in a German defeat of the Battle of Tannenberg. Now, on the German side of the war, out of 150,000 men, only about 12,000 men took casualty to the battle, which in essence is a absolute huge success compared to the Russian numbers and losses. And this was seen as Germany's greatest victory of the war because, frankly, the war had just kicked off and was a huge motivator for how Germany would set the pace of the war and determine whether or not they could keep up with these kind of movements or not. Now, my partner is going to describe to you how the Russians saw this battle and what it looked through their eyes. Thank you.
Okay, so now I'm going to go over the side of the Battle of Tannenberg that pertains to the Russian side of the Battle of Tannenberg, and kind of talk about how overall this was a devastating loss for Russia during the grand scheme of World War I and continuing on after World War I. So to start, I'm going to kind of talk about the state of the country of Russia during this time. Before the battle, the Russian Empire was facing a very tough situation on their eastern front. And this was due to the fact that Germany and other Central Powers were starting to mobilize and starting to create war efforts and starting to attack other places. And Russia inevitably knew that Germany was going to come in to attack them through East Prussia. This made the Russian military have to mobilize forces to combat the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary. However, this led to some difficulties for the Russian military as they are still in the early stages of mobilization and they are not yet quite ready. And additionally, Russia was experiencing difficulties between poor communication between leaders, which obviously led to difficulties with leadership throughout the Russian army. This also became apparent as Russia's military was very large. They had a very adequate number of soldiers, right? I mean, look at this. There's thousands of soldiers there, but Russia was unprepared in the fact that they had inadequate training and inadequate equipment to other forces. This made the Russian forces vulnerable to the attacks of Germany as through technologies and tactics, which gave Germany the slight edge before the battle even started. Now, it's very important to know who was in charge of Russia during this time. And the man that was in charge of Russia during the Battle of Tannenberg was this guy right here, Tsar Nicholas II. Tsar Nicholas II had been the Tsar of Russia since 1984. And while Tsar Nicholas was the commander-in-chief of Russia during this time, he was not necessarily in charge of planning army's tactics and strategies before the Battle of Tannenberg. It's also important to know that there are two very important key commanders on the Russian side of this fight. The first being General Paul von Rennenkampf, who's that guy over there with the big mustache. He was the commander of the first Russian military during this battle. And then there's this guy right here, General Alexander Samsonov, who was the commander of the second Russian army during this battle. And as I previously mentioned, there's two main Russian units involved in this battle. The first being the First Russian Army with General Rennenkampf, and the second being the Second Russian Army with General Samsonov. So now I'm going to go over a basic play-by-play of how this battle took place. First, I'm going to start with the main tactic and strategy that Russia wanted to use during this battle. Russia wanted to go with an offensive strike-first kind of mentality to catch the German units off guard. And they were going to do this by using a two-front strategy. One, with the First Army right here of Russia, with General Rennenkampf, they were going to invade East Prussia from the north. And the other front was going to be the Second Russian Army, who was going to attack East Prussia from the south with General Samsonov. These two armies planned to meet at the end of the war for a final push to kind of gain territory into East Prussia, and they're going to meet together in order to beat Germany at the end of this battle. However, as I said, this was a devastating blow to Russia in the end, and this is due to a couple of key flaws in the Russian attack. First and foremost, there was very poor communication between General Rennenkampf and General Samsonov. These two leaders were actually on bad terms during this battle, and the poor communication made the army very susceptible to German counterattacks. The Russian leadership also very much underestimated the strength of the Germans during this battle. They did not know the technology and tactics that Germany was going to use during this battle. Additionally, because of the poor communication and honestly the poor leadership of the Russian army during this battle, the Russian army had a lack of flexibility, and they could not be able to defend the German counterattacks that Germany obviously had to offer during this battle. Lastly, the main major flaw with this battle is the fact that the Russian army had a lack of reserves to help fight them during this battle, which made the ultimate retreat at the end of this battle very chaotic and made the Russia experience a lot of casualties. So this battle ended with Germany leading flank attacks around right here, and they eventually encircled the Russian army, which ultimately ended up being the Second Russian Army, and this led to a very chaotic retreat by this Russian army. And the lack of strategy within this retreat led to many Russian units becoming encircled and surrounded by German troops, and obviously this is going to lead to a massive amount of casualties and a massive amount of prisoners of war. In fact, there were 92,000 prisoners of war during this battle, and there's around 30,000 casualties. Most of these casualties came through artillery fire and infantry attacks, which is kind of new during this battle because the advance of machine guns and the advance of rifles in general, with there being bolt action rifles, there's many more deaths and casualties because of the advancement of the guns. And due to this devastating loss, especially by the Second Russian Army, General Samsonov ended up taking his own life because of the failed leadership that he had, and he could not deal with the loss of his armies. So this picture, I think, perfectly kind of describes how this battle went. So we have the two fronts right here, right? We have the Second Russian Army, and we have the First Russian Army. Obviously, Rennenkampf's First Russian Army was trying to push north into East Prussia, and this is the original wall of defense that Germany had. And the Second Russian Army with Samsonov was trying to push south. Obviously, Germany led all these flank attacks with General Hindenburg right there, and they were obviously able to meet the Second Russian Army where they were. Now, the Second Russian Army was not ready for these counterattacks, which led to them being encircled with all these different flank attacks that Germany had for Russia, which ultimately led to Russia's demise in this battle, and which ended up being a huge blow for Russia on the grand scale of the Great War. So, this battle was actually very important, had a lot of major impacts on Russia as a country. This major loss in the retreated Russian forces from East Prussia led to many more challenges for the rest of the war with the Russian army, right? I mean, they just lost 120,000 soldiers during this one battle alone. You're obviously going to be very, very light, and you're not going to be as strong in numbers for the rest of the battle. And this major defeat also left many Russians to become dissatisfied with Tsar Nicholas II's leadership. Now, obviously, after a major defeat, losing 120,000 soldiers in one battle, you're going to be a little bit upset with the leadership of the country. But Tsar Nicholas tried to take matters into his own hands because after this battle, Tsar Nicholas took personal command of the Russian army as he was trying to fix the Russian army. However, many historians will note that Tsar Nicholas's increased role of the army had very little impact on the success of the Russian army throughout the war. And additionally, this was one of the major mistakes of Tsar Nicholas's leadership, as he was tying his success as a Tsar, as the leader of the country, to the success of the military, which ultimately led to his demise as a leader. It's also important to note that many Russian soldiers felt very abandoned by their commanders and by their leaders during this time and during the war. Um, there's a lot of different failures when it came to leadership, especially with communication through leadership, which led to many of their soldiers, many of their brothers being taken prisoner of war or killed. And so these soldiers kind of started to question the competence of the leaders of the Russian military, which obviously led to the Russian military kind of depleting from the inside out. And lastly, this loss brought a lot of civil unrest to the civilians of Russia, as they felt fearful and hopeless, as Russia's army was falling apart from the inside out, and they were already struggling in the war. And this loss brought a lot of economic difficulties to the people of Russia. And according to many historians, the loss of this battle brought unrest and disadvantage for the rest of the war, along with the unrest of the people of Russia. And this especially pertained to the leadership of Tsar Nicholas II, as well as a lot of other military commanders, which ultimately led to the Russian Revolution in 1917. And as we know now, this is some propaganda from the Russian Revolution, and this led to Russia becoming a communist country, and many other poor leaders such as Joseph Stalin took over after this time. So to kind of conclude, the Battle of Tannenberg was actually a major defeat for Russia and became very important in the rest of the history of Russia due to the civilians of Russia becoming dissatisfied with the leadership and Russia becoming not a power and losing a lot of strength within their military. Thank you for listening to our presentation about the Battle of Tannenberg. We hope you learned a lot. Thank you.